Scotty, I think you're the perfect definition of an all-rounder. I mean, you've got a master's in divinity, you're a theologian, a writer, a designer, editor of Intrepid magazine, and many other things. But more recently, you've focused on sort of paranormal and unexplained phenomena and ancient mysteries, and you've written several books on those subjects. What sort of steered you off in that direction?
Oh boy. Well, I'll make one correction there. I got 2 years in toward my master's. I never did finish my master's degree. But I was in Bible college and then went on to theological seminary, and where I was studying for my master's. And I was in church work for a while. I worked as a youth pastor, so I was in ministry. And that was in my 20s, my early to mid-20s, and as I moved on in that, there were things that bothered me in church politics and methodology and things like that, and that really started converting over into questions about the theology itself and the systematic theology. And so the more I studied and the more I asked questions, I found myself drifting away from that. And finding that there were other spiritualities that said kind of the same thing, other religions that said the same thing. It was really the questioning part. It's if God is supposed to be this and our religion says this, why are we doing this? And why is everybody else, and so I've never been an all roads lead to Rome type of person. And I kind of fought against that with our theology. I was very conservative, fundamentalist, Baptist, all of that. And so it was really the questioning process and trying to find answers to things and not getting satisfactory answers within the framework that I was in. So that, and then of course curiosity. I say in the opening of The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, I spent far too many hours as a kid with my hands folded behind my head and laying on the top of my mother's garage looking at the stars, wondering what was out there. And so I think that really was the basis, the curiosity as a kid that morphed into the curiosity as an adult that combined and started holding hands with the questioning the tradition. And that really led me to the things that I got into.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And this book, you mentioned The Rise and the Fall of the Nephilim. For those who don't know, could you explain what or who are the Nephilim?
Sure. This was one of those big questions I had, theologically speaking. In the book of Genesis, it talks about, in chapter 6, it talks about, and in those days the sons of God came down and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. And they were known as the Nephilim, and they were on the earth in those days and also afterward. And it kind of leaves off right there, and it goes right into the account of the story of Noah and the ark. And we were never taught about this much, even in seminary, where we're supposed to be schooled in all the intricacies of our faith and our theology. And I would say, who are these sons of God? And I started looking into reading what the Hebrew version said of that. If you go back to when we say original text, you're talking about the original languages the thing was written in. And it calls them the Bnei Ha-Elohim, the sons of the Elohim came down and intermingled with the daughters of Adam, or of mankind. And so when I asked the question, who are these guys? I was given answers like, well, you're going to start causing trouble with this, and you have to realize this is nothing but human beings. These were the sons of the men who built the school of the prophets, and they came down kind of slumming into the valley with the common women, and they bore offspring. And I said, well, if the Bible, as you teach us in systematic theology, is supposed to be logical, and language means something, I said, the language doesn't say the sons of Adam, humans, came down and intermingled with the lower class of humans. It doesn't say that. It says there's a stark contrast, the Elohim versus Adam. And I was told in so many words, you're a troublemaker and you need to stow that or go somewhere else. And I had some seminary professors who actually you're a troublemaker, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we'll talk about this over coffee. And so the Nephilim, it appears, are the offspring of a group that the Bible calls the sons of God in the English, and in the Hebrew, the Bnei Ha-Elohim, which means those who are of the Elohim, or the bequeathed of the Elohim. And so then you have to figure, well, who are the Elohim? And one of the names used for God in the Old Testament, the most, almost 3,000 times, is the word Elohim. And El is the name for God. Him is a plural suffix that's tacked on a word in the Hebrew to denote plurality. And so, literally, the name used for God himself, the most in the Old Testament, almost 3,000 times, literally defines as God among or of many gods, Elohim. And then there's a passage in the book of Psalms, Psalm 82, where it's got God talking to a group known as the Divine Council, kind of an obscure group in the Old Testament, in heaven, the Divine Council. And God says to them, well, the passage actually reads, and Elohim stood in the midst of the Elohim, and he said to them, you are all Elohim, the bright shining princes of heaven. And then he goes to pass judgment on them for something which is not mentioned in the passage. And in a sense, what it started to look like is the God that I was taught was the one and only God, monotheism in the Old Testament, is really a little different than that. It almost looks like the Hebrews themselves had a pantheon of gods, these Elohim, much like Zeus and the Olympians. You had
Yes,
Elohim.
we see that in many ancient traditions and mythologies,
Yes.
this plurality of gods,
Yes,
and a hierarchy of gods.
I would step out on a limb and say the Old Testament does not strictly teach monotheism. And when you remember the origins of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, it says it was written by Moses, which I don't believe there's any reason to doubt. I believe he was an historical character, a real person. I think he has become, however, Israelite or Jewish myth, legend. Let's say he was legend. And so a lot is built up around about him, much like you see the legends of in America here, folk legend, Paul Bunyan, what are some of the Davy Crockett, how these guys were real guys, but there's legends that have built up around them, and they become legendary. I think Moses was the same, but when he wrote these books, we got to keep one thing in mind. For 80 years of his life, he was Egyptian. He was pure Egyptian when he left Egypt after the first 40 years. Even though he might have been of Israelite blood, he was Egyptian. And then he went and he married the daughter of the pagan high priest of Midian and learned the Sinaitic religions and the Sumerian religions, the Canaanite religions. And the first 80 years before he had his big spiritual epiphany at the burning bush, he was pagan. He was not a Jehovah worshiper. He was not a Yahweh worshiper. He was not a Jew. He created Judaism. And so you see that the tendrils of all this and everything he wrote, if you look for it, if you don't start out saying, well, my faith says this, and I have to filter everything through my faith. The faith is the thing that we build. You have to go anthropologically, if you will, archaeologically, historically, and look at how these things were put together. And when you do that, it's either one of two things. It's either you've discovered that Hebrew religion, therefore Christianity, were all built out of whole cloth. They were all built by people. It was people. Or it's God is real exactly as we were taught in church and synagogue, and everything else is a lie of the devil. So, that's almost what it came down to. So I went through a bit of a struggle of faith with all of this stuff, too, because when you're the first 45 years of your life, my life, not you, you're much younger than that, were spent in one theology, and you start questioning that by the things you're writing about, you'll have a little crisis of faith that goes on.
Shakes foundations.
And it did. It did, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I guess the big question that comes out of this is, who are the sons of gods? Who are the gods? In all the ancient mythology, there's reference to the gods. They have these powers. They have, power over man. Who were they? What's your theory about this?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? Who are these guys? Are they pure mythology? Were they just are they just the objects of religious mythology, or were they somebody? And so the big speculation comes in. It's almost like I just said about comparing the different kinds of ways to approach this information. It's either they were gods and angels and they were divinity of some sort, or when you start comparing the Hebrew Bible to all the other religions out there, everybody has their versions of this same story. The flood story. I never knew this, but the Nephilim are actually the preamble to the flood story in the book of Genesis. You go out there and there's over 600 different flood stories and flood accounts in ancient mythology and ancient religion, and they all pretty much talk about the same thing. And so when you boil it all down, you take all the religious dross off of everything, and you look at all these different accounts, you say something happened to the human race a long time ago. And it's either all these different cultures had somebody they sent to some big ecumenical meeting 7,000 years ago, and they all smoked the same peyote, and they all went back with the same drunken stories and made up their versions, or everybody experienced something. There was a proto-religion. There was something that took place. And so where we say, and this has been addressed in science fiction for decades, but the topic that says perhaps what ancient man has called gods, angels, devils, demons, and everything in between was actually something very different. Their encounters may have been with, and this is what I write about, it may have been about extraterrestrial. They are beings not of this world. It might be, if I could poof up my hair and go, it's aliens, I could say it might have been. We don't know. We weren't there. Yeah. All we know is that mankind ended up with all these different versions of these stories, and they call them gods and angels and devils and demons and everything in between. But I think that we encountered something much different. Mm-hmm. What that was exactly, I don't know. I can say it may have been ancient extraterrestrial beings interacting with us. It may be that ancient alien beings are actually gods and demons and devils and angels. We don't know for sure. And what bothers me the most is that if God is who God says he is, he doesn't come down and try to prove the case either way himself. But he has all the divine power to do that, supposedly. And so we're left fumbling around to determine our eternal destinies, to determine our faiths, all based on having about that much information that could fill a thimble. And the rest we've got to make up. And, Paul the Apostle in the New Testament said, work out your own religion with meekness and fear. I don't know what he was getting at there, but this is really what it starts to come down to, is there isn't a lot of proof for anything. God doesn't go out of the way to prove himself. We certainly don't have aliens coming down and proving themselves. So we're left with this information. This is why I think science and academia and skepticism, if you will boil it down to just the facts, man. And they'll say, because there are no facts that you can prove, it's obvious that it's culture evolving, and everybody had their mythologies. So the big question is, who was it? I don't know. I happen to think that we were visited by some kind of beings that we classified as gods and everything in between, gods and demons. And people think you're nuts or you're way out there on a limb if you say, I believe it was extraterrestrials. Well, when I put it this way, I say, I believe there was paleo contact in our ancient past by somebody, not of this realm, be it interdimensional, be it extraterrestrial, be it something. And when you look at the vastness of the universe and say it's impossible that anything else visited us, I think that's as wacky as saying it's aliens. So there's my very long circular answer to your very simple question.
Well, I think it's so important to address the question because, as you said, when you were studying divinity, this very important line in Genesis has really been swept under the carpet. And everyone knows about Noah and the flood and many of the other famous Bible stories. But why don't many people know about this very key line in Genesis? Because we don't have the clear answers, and it makes people uncomfortable.
And we avoid it. How many times, and if you attended did you attend Sunday school when you were growing up, little kid?
I did, yes.
How many times did you hear a Sunday school teacher with the little felt cutouts, and here's Noah, and here's the animals 2 by 2. Oh, and here's the beings that came down and impregnated the women and had offspring. You don't hear about that very much in Sunday school.
Yeah.
It's an avoided topic because nobody really knows how to address it.
And it does raise another question, which is this so-called mixing between sons of gods and daughters of men. Was this purposeful with the intention of creating a new type of race of people, or was it simply driven by desire? What are your thoughts on that?
I think in the passages you'll find, now the book of Genesis, which introduces it, deals with it in 4 verses, renders no judgment, good or bad, on it. It's just there, and then he moves on. But if you go to the books like the book of Enoch, who was supposedly alive during the time he wrote this, and people say, well, Enoch, that was written in the 4th century BC. Well, yeah, it was rewritten in the 4th century BC, just like everything else in the Old Testament. It was recompiled and rewritten, but the book is much older. And he devotes 11 full chapters, a whole section of his book, to these beings. And so trying to decipher who they are and why they did what they did is the big question. But what we found in Enoch, we find in Genesis, is that these sons of God were enamored with the daughters of men. And they desired them, is what it says. And they wanted to come and not just rape them and pillage them and have children with them. It talks about, in the book of Enoch, it talks about how they saw them. In some versions it says they lusted after them. In other versions it says they desired them. Other versions it says they cohabited with them. And then in the book of Enoch it talks about how not only did they do this act of impregnation, but it says they taught them the forbidden knowledge of God. They taught them, and the forbidden knowledges of God were listed as things like cosmology, the signs of the sun, moon, and the stars, agriculture, makeup, cosmetics, the making of weapons and mirrors. These are all things that were said that we were taught by these beings. And if they're just there raping and pillaging, and impregnating willy-nilly, I don't think that's what they were doing. I think that there was genuine love that they had for these beings. And what I have found is that the great sin of these beings, that they were all had judgment cast on them, as you read Psalm 82, that judgment was because the act they committed of intermingling, it wasn't as much about that, as it was about them sharing the forbidden knowledge of God or of the gods. And so in a sense, they bred up these humans, is the way it says. And it says there were 200 of them in the book of Enoch that came down and set foot on the slopes of Mount Armon, which is Mount Hermon in northern Israel today. And it's actually that mountain, it's a 3-peaked mountain that straddles the Golan Heights today. You think Golan Heights and you get the idea of the area it was in. And it says they gave this knowledge. So their motivations, I think, for as much as you can read between the lines, it's almost like they cared for them. They came down and they craved that relationship that they did not have where they came from. And they intermingled. At least this is what the text seemed to imply. They intermingled, they cared for them, they taught them, they gave them things. And in turn, they had relation. It says, and they dwelt with them, they cohabited with them. Mm-hmm. If it's an act of some kind of odd rape of some kind, I have never seen rape categorized as cohabitation. Mm. Yeah. So it has something to do with a care and a concern that was there. And there was judgment passed on them for it. And there was the chief god rendered judgment and wanted to wipe them all out, all their offspring, because it was an abomination. It was a mixture, a mingling that shouldn't have happened. And you actually get a hint of this. It happened much earlier than this. If you look at the Garden of Eden story, we all know that story and could recite it in probably 10 seconds. God made Adam and Eve, put them in the garden. They ate of the tree they weren't supposed to eat of, and whoosh, sin nature came, and God passed judgment on them all. However, I think that's an encoded story, because you've got the character, the serpent character in the garden was the bad guy. He's the one who came and tempted Eve. But he's never called Satan. He's never called the devil. Anything. He's never even called Lucifer. Those are attributed much later, 1,000 years later. Those are attributed to him. In the passage, he's known as Nakosh. And Nakosh in the Garden of Eden, the serpent character, defines as the trickster character, which you find throughout many different cultures. There's a trickster character. He is the bringer of knowledge, which is very interesting. He is the illuminator. He is the bright shining one. And the same word, Nekoshta, is used later in the Old Testament when Moses raises the brazen serpent up on a pole when all the people are being bitten by vipers. And it says the people were being rebellious, so God sends vipers to bite them all and kill them. But then tells Moses, but if you make a brazen serpent and put it on a pole, and if people look at that, they'll be healed. So in a sense, God sends these vipers to kill everybody, and then also gives a method for them to also be saved. And so Moses raises, that's called the Nakashta, that's that brazen serpent. So the bright shining one relates back to that Psalm 82 passages, where God says, you are all Elohim, the bright shining princes of heaven. The story of the Garden of Eden is not about eating a forbidden piece of fruit. It's about forbidden knowledge being given to the humans, and it's about impregnation. I believe the Nakosh, the serpent character, impregnated Eve. And this is all borne out in those passages, by the way. I'm not just sucking this out of my thumb. That whole passage afterwards gives very clear indications as to what happened there. So I believe there was an impregnation. She bore Cain, while at the same time, she also went in, it says, unto her husband and gave this gift to him as well. And I believe Cain was the first of the Nephilim, even though he's not called that. You'll notice, after the whole forbidden fruit thing, there's a passage, it's right there in Genesis 3, it says, and Elohim said, the humans have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and have become just like us. Let us therefore go down and prevent them from also eating of the tree of life, lest they become just like gods. And so the questions that made me think of is, number one, what did Elohim have against the humans having knowledge?
Yes.
And then number two, who were the Elohim and who was Elohim if we could become just like him? And so they went down and they performed some kind of preventive measures so the humans wouldn't become just like them. Plurality. Again, you see the plurality. Then he goes down, and remember in the passage he's looking for Adam, and he says, Adam, he calls out, and no answer, and he calls Adam. Adam says, we're hiding. And God said, why are you hiding? And he says, we're naked. And I always wondered what this thing about being naked had to do with the fall of mankind. Well, we're naked. Naked and open. Naked, and it could be literal nakedness. It could be, I think it's an allegorical story. We're naked. We are ripped open before you. And he says, who told you were naked? Where'd you get this knowledge? Well, and then, of course, Adam, well, the woman you gave me, she gave me this piece of fruit. And the woman's like, oh, the snake, and who is Nakosh. And so then God utters these judgments against them. And this is where you start to get a clearer picture of what's going on. He says to the serpent, he utters what is known in theology as a messianic prophecy. The very first prophecy of a coming Messiah, which in the Hebrew sense, Messiah became known as the kinsman redeemer, the one who would be one of us, redeemer. Now, if you've gone to church, even at Christmas time, you'll hear a pastor or a priest might say at Christmas time, a watered-down version of this. He'll say, Jesus came and he was one of us. He had to be one of us. That's the kenosis, the emptying of himself. In theology, that Jesus had to be born of a woman. God had to come in the form of a man to redeem us, which is, by the way, impregnation from an external source and a not human source. So God looks at Satan, at the serpent, who we've called Satan, who was never called Satan in the passage, and says, and there will be a day when you will bite his heel, but he will return and crush your head. This is known in rabbinic circles, in Christian theology. This is a messianic prophecy. The coming of the Messiah is being prophesied. And that this Messiah would have to be, eventually became known as one of us. He had to be one of the humans to do it. Then he goes on to curse them all in that passage in Genesis, and he says, and there will be constant enmity or strife or conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the humans. And then you have, if you look at the back out from the Old Testament and start to look at the whole picture, you've got all these genealogies in the Old Testament. And Ahab begot Lamech, and Lamech lay with 7 women and begat 4 sons. And, it goes on for 13 chapters in one spot. And what they're doing is they're laying out the lineage of the firstborn of the Hebrews to show that the Messiah had a pure human bloodline from which the Messiah would come. Now, if you spend that much time, in a literary sense, writing about why it is important that the pure-blooded kinsman redeemer must come from this line, he must be of pure human blood, over and over and over again, it's obviating the opposite. And the opposite being, there is an opposite bloodline. He cannot be of that other bloodline. He has to be of the pure human bloodline. And this is mentioned over and over and over again throughout Scripture. Then they take the time to go from David, and they trace King David's lineage in the 900s, the 10th century BC, all the way back to Noah, then all the way back to Adam. But they don't trace him through the firstborn son like they do traditionally with everybody else. Cain's the firstborn. Why don't they use Cain? Well, because Cain is not of pure human blood going back to Adam. He's of this mixed blood of Eve and Nakash. They take and they trace. Now, Cain murdered his brother Abel. Abel's got no kids. Chicken scratched through Abel. He's gone. They trace through the third-born son, Seth, to Adam to prove the human bloodline. When they come to Jesus in the New Testament, they take Mary, the mother of Jesus, and trace her back to David to establish, because after the time of David, something changed. The Messiah also had to be not just the kinsman redeemer, but he also had to come from the line of David, the royal line, to show that he had claims to the throne of Israel. So so they trace her back to David, then they trace again back to Noah, and again back to Adam through Seth, to show that Jesus, or the Christian's version of the Messiah, had to come through that pure human blood, which was, by the way, Christianity is just Judaism. We're just a sect of Judaism. And so when you start looking at the bigger picture, theologically speaking, from Judeo-Christianity, there's 2 of the hugest 3 religions in the world. You've all of a sudden, you see a much different picture of what happened in Genesis. Mm-hmm. And the Nephilim are not limited to that one single story. I believe, as I stated earlier, Cain was the first of the Nephilim, the first of the non-human mixture. And by the way, what does it say he did? He murders Abel. We see, and I found this very interesting as a side note, that in the passage you have all these conversations going on between God and Cain, but you don't have, who's supposed to be the one who was not righteous, but you have nothing between God and Abel, who was supposed to be the righteous one. Mm-hmm. God keeps talking to Cain and telling him, he warns him, he says, sin's at the door, don't murder your brother. But you never see him saying to Abel, hey, watch out, your brother's going to kill you. And then after he kills Abel, God comes to him, and what does Cain say? He says, where am I going to go? He says, wherever I go, people will know that I've done this thing. Well, by my accounting in the biblical passage, there's 3 people on the planet. Where's he going where people are going to know him? And then it says he runs off to the land of Nod to the east and marries a woman, has a child, builds a city. And who's he built this city for? Was it just a private little hobby? He goes, hey, look at all these great buildings I put together. We need people. It says he built a city. And he named it after his firstborn son, Enoch, which is not the same Enoch of the book of Enoch. And Enoch, by ancient linguistics, and this is where linguistics is fun. You go into ancient linguistics, and Enoch actually interprets as the E becomes a U, the N becomes an R. Don't ask me why it works that way. It just does. It's ancient linguistics for the Middle East. Enoch is actually the word Uruk, and Uruk is the ancient word for Iraq. So in a sense, what Cain has done, he's built the city of Iraq. He's built the city of Uruk. And which means, by another definition, it means the first city. If you go to Iraq today, to this ancient city of Uruk, which is still there, it's a big and polluted industrial center right now, Uruk still means first beautiful city. And so it's very interesting. But when you start breaking these mythologies down, what I call biblical mythologies, we accept them as we grow up in Judeo-Christianity. We accept these things by faith to be true and real. Yet they're just versions of the same legends that everybody else has, the same mythologies. Mm. And in the second book on the reptilians, I got into this even more and talked about how Moses, when he brought everything that he had to the table and he starts writing these things, he's incorporating Sumerian religion and culture, Egyptian religion and culture, and builds Judaism out of whole cloth. You look at the Sumerian story of the gods, the Anunnaki, who was the god caste, just like the Olympians, just like the Elohim. They were the god caste of the ancient Sumerians. And their chief god, Elil, conscripts Enki, who is also known as Ea, to create humanity. Or as it says in the old cuneiform texts, when you read them, it talks about create primeval man to do our work for us. And what do? They create primeval man who is digging their trenches and canals for them, mining their natural resources, tilling their land. And then the humans cry out. Later in those cuneiform texts, you find Atrahasis, the king of the city of Eridu, their patron god Enki, who created Enki Ea, he's also known as, in the neighboring city-state. And he calls out to Enki Ea to deliver them from this bondage to the gods. And Enki comes down, hears their plight, comes down with all his mighty warriors from the heavens, and he delivers them, helps them rebel again, gives them the forbidden knowledge of the gods, and they rebel. And for this, Elil casts judgment on Enki and his followers and casts them to the subterranean caverns of the earth to dwell forever as punishment. Now you move forward about 1,500 to 2,000 years to the time of Moses when he's writing the book of Genesis. Elil has now become, to the Canaanites, El, or to the Hebrews, the Hebrew culture, the Israelites, he's become El, which is the word for God. And they incorporate that into El, Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon. You've got Enki, known as Ea. That same migration of culture and religion, Ea becomes known as Yahweh, which is the base word for Jehovah. You've got Moses writing about man and woman being created by El, being placed in the garden to do what? To till the ground and keep it for him. Then you've got the serpent character, Nakash, comes in, and God renders judgment, and Nakash is cast to the ground and the subterranean caverns of the earth, as the old legends tell us. Hell was always in the center of the earth. And so all of these things have connectivities, and I believe all that Moses did when he wrote this stuff, he borrowed all this stuff from the other cultures. I just wrote about this in our new book coming out in October, The Exodus Reality. When Moses was sitting at the burning bush, his spiritual epiphany, we don't know exactly what happened there because he's the only one that was there, and he wrote about it. And he said it was a bush that was burning, and remember when he asked God, he says, "Whom shall I tell the people sent me?" He's looking for the private name of God. And God says, "None of your business what my private name is. You tell them I am sent you. I am that I am." Remember that? literally kind of translating out to being, I am that I am they speak of. Well, Moses is using a play on words. Without getting too deep into the linguistics, if you trace the origins of that phrase, I am, it traces back to a Sumerian phrase, which actually literally translated as, get this, Enki. And so in essence, what God is saying at the burning bush is, I am that Enki you think of. When you think of Enki, that's who I am. And why does he use that allusion? Because I believe the children of Israel in bondage in Egypt, who Moses leads out, they weren't a bunch of Jews that were looking for their homeland, that had a Judaic religion, or they were a bunch of Semitic people that had risen out of one family that migrated there. And I don't believe that they were Jehovah worshipers at all. Why do you think, let me ask you this question. If you were one of these slaves and you saw these miraculous wonders of God and these 10 plagues, you're backed up against the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army is coming down on you, and Moses spreads the rod across, while the waters part in front of your eyes and you cross over on dry land. Then you watch it close over and drown the armies of Pharaoh. If you saw all of that, would you 2 weeks later be saying, Aaron, build us a calf, a golden calf, that will be our God? And 2 weeks later, Moses is up in the mountain, and he goes up there for 40 days. And what do the people say? Literally, it translates. It says in the Bible, where is this man Moses? He's up in the mountain. Build us this golden calf. You translate that in the vernacular, they say, where's this guy, Moses? He let us out. Who is he? Where'd he go? Why don't you build us a golden calf? And the golden calf is none other than Hathor, the cow goddess of Egypt. The bringer of fertility, of happiness, of life. And so they build the golden calf. These people were not Jews. Moses built Judaism over the next 40 years. And so all of this information, when you start looking at it, you start to see a picture in the Bible of visitation from somewhere. This visitation mirrors visitations mentioned in other cultures. You have religion building off of it. You have legend and myth building off of it. So it comes down to, who the hell are we worshiping? Who are these people? And you have to ask the question. It begs the question. The only way you can believe it is by faith, because there is no proof that it is a God. And I'm not anti-God. I talk about this to my old seminary buddies. They're like, oh, man, you're a backslider. You need to get right with God. And I say, that's not what I think it is. And I hate that, frankly. I hate it because it challenged what I believed for 45 years. And now it's something that I have to step outside that box and look back in. We were visited by somebody a long, long time ago, and it spawned all these different religions and mythologies and interpretations of those events. But I think they all have a common source.
Yeah, I mean, people look at the idea of extraterrestrials as being something crazy. But with all the texts you referred to, all the linkages, all the linguistics, you look at it from that perspective, and it fits in very well together. I mean, all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle.
Look at science itself. I was intrigued by this not long ago. There was one of the big telescopes. It wasn't the Hubble. It was the next generation after the Hubble telescope. They wanted to focus on a portion of space that looks blank to the naked eye and to our common telescopes. And it was about the size, if you take your pinky fingernail and hold it up, there was a size, I think it was in there was a certain constellation they looked at, and I can't remember which one. Just blank. And they did an infrared exposure of that little tiny in the whole of the sky, that little tiny spot, for over 10 days. And what they came back with was amazing. They found in that little tiny blank spot in the sky, in all of the night sky, there were over 10,000 galaxies.
Gosh.
And when you do the exponential math on that, this is where you get, you used to make fun because Carl Sagan used to say there's billions and billions. There's billions and billions of stars.
Yeah.
Billions and billions of galaxies. Look at our galaxy alone. How many solar systems might there be in this galaxy? And then you exponentially do the math when there's 10,000 plus galaxies in a spot that's as small as your pinky fingernail up in the sky at night, and you do that exponential math. The probability of there being life-sustaining planets otherwhere is astronomical. Science even admits that. The big problem they all have is, well, why would they come here? Does anybody have the technology to make it here? That's the big question now. Not whether there is life, but whether, phooey, they didn't come here. And I think of Richard Feynman, the late Richard Feynman. He's a contemporary of Einstein and Oppenheimer, a astrophysicist. And he said something to the effect of, in referencing all of this vastness of the universe, saying, and to think, he says, in our mythologies is what he's getting at. He says that God, in one of his aspects, came here to this planet, here. He said, I find that to be too provincial, too local, too colloquial to wrap my head around. And he says, frankly, I'm perfectly comfortable feeling lost in an infinite universe. To me, this is what it begins to look like, is that there's something else out there that had effect on us. That's not the stuff of science fiction. We've made it into science fiction. If our consciousnesses, our brains are all part of the greater cosmos, if you will, we're all a part of everything that exists is part of the greater whole. Just on a physical level, a physics level, we're all part of the same thing. You can add morals and ethics and religion and spirituality, all of that later. That's all sub-functions of everything that we do. But we are all part of the greater whole. And when you start to look at that and say, on a physics level, a scientific level, we are all part of the same thing. We all interact and function together in one way or another. The probability of visitation from possible life elsewhere becomes very easy to accept on a scientific level. The other questions just come up, well, why aren't they still doing it? And why did they quit 5,000 years ago? And blah, blah, blah. And maybe they haven't. Maybe that's the big key right there. So.
Yeah. And I think quite an interesting point is that all these ancient mythologies have so many similarities between them, yet supposedly had no contact with each other,
right,
which suggests that they all had the same kind of interaction with whoever came and visited this planet, which then influenced, their cultures and religions and everything. Exactly.
And then when you start looking at things like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, start going to other cultures and find all the different linkages to serpents. You've got Quetzalcoatl of the Mayans, the feathered serpent god. And what did he do? He came and he delivered the forbidden knowledge of the gods to the humans and was condemned for it. You have Krishna, who sat beneath the banyan tree on top of a coiled serpent and delivered what? The forbidden knowledge of the gods to the humans. And there is some interpretation that says that he was condemned for that and died for that. You've got all these different cultures that have the serpentine and the serpentine all ties back to it. In the biblical sense, it ties back to the Nephilim. The Elohim, those who bequeathed the Nephilim. And so you have all these cultures saying the very same thing in different ways, and you have to ask, so which one is the fundamental right one again? I don't think there's any way to know.
Yeah. Well, we certainly don't have all the answers to these questions, but I think it's really important to be asking the questions and to be exploring those questions, no matter how much they sort of draw us out of our comfort circles. It's
right.
It seems, so important for the origin of humans to know about this.
It certainly does.
Now, I wanted to ask you about the Paradigm Symposium, because this is something that you're heavily involved in, and it's coming up fairly soon, in October. Can you explain a bit about that?
I will. I founded Intrepid Magazine about a little over 2 years ago, and we're kind of a journal that's dedicated to all of this stuff that we're talking about: science, politics, religion, metaphysics, ufology, paleocontact, things like that. I like to say Intrepid Magazine, as the founder and publisher, it's all the stuff I like, and that's why we write about it. But I was talking to Micah Hanks, my partner in all of this, who's an author and has the Graylian Report and other things that he does, radio show, a couple of years ago, and I said, you know what? We really need to put together an event that brings out some good speakers, that where it's not just the fan-based stuff. And I used to work for the Ghost Hunters as the editor-in-chief of their magazine, and I saw all these events and attended all these events, and I said, let's do something that's very meaningful and appeals to the intellect more than just, you get to ghost hunt with a TV star. And so we put together the Paradigm Symposium last year, and it was in October last year. We had Eric von Daniken, author of Chariots of the Gods and 32 other books. We had all the talking heads from H2's Ancient Aliens were there. Philip Coppens, the late Philip Coppens, very sad to say. And George Norrie was there from Coast to Coast Radio, and a bunch of authors that you'd recognize and pundits in this field. And so we're doing it again this year, and we changed up the cast of speakers a bit, and we have Robert Bauval, Dr. Robert Schoch. Robert Bauval, Egyptologist. You've seen him all over. He's been all over Ancient Aliens in the past. Same with Robert Schoch, Egyptologist, geologist. Scott Wolter, who is the host of the new H2 show, America Unearthed. And L.A. Marzulli, and wrote the Nephilim series, and very well known for his work on that and the Watchers, and several other authors. And that's happening this October in St. Paul, Minnesota, the 17th through the 20th of October. And you can go to ParadigmSymposium.com, get your tickets. And yes, it can be a spendy weekend if you're coming in from out of state and you have to stay at a hotel and so on. But go to our website, ParadigmSymposium.com. Take a look at what's there, who all is speaking. Phenomenal time. Ask anybody who was there last year. And also, you happen to be right now in the thick of a Labor Day. Everybody else does it around here in America, a Labor Day holiday special. We're running if you buy one ticket right now of any of the three tiers, big, bigger, or biggest ticket, you get 20% off. If you buy two, you get 30% off. But we're only running that till September 4th, and everything's back up to full price forever. And
so people have to get in quickly.
Now is a good time to get your tickets. And the big, bigger, and biggest, we've only got 14 of the biggest tickets left, and that is everything. The all-inclusive, you get in on the VIP private cocktail party, the banquet, the VIP panel discussion, and all the lectures. And then the big and the bigger tickets are just different variations of those. So go take a look, and if you like this kind of thing, and you want to attend this thing and hear these people speaking, I like to say this is the most eclectic collection of the most esoteric minds on these topics. And so go take a look.
Sounds excellent. And is it going to be recorded? Is it going to be available after the event? It's going
to be recorded. We are going to put it on DVDs, and so that will be available. And so you'll always be able to hear what these people said, but there's nothing like coming and being right there.
Being there in person. So. Yeah. Well, Scotty, thank you very much. It's been really interesting hearing all of that and given a lot of insights. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, April. I sure appreciate your having me.